Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Street Apologist Live. I'm your host, Vocab Alone, and I know it's Labor Day, but we still got to do a little bit of labor over here. You know how it is. You get a day off, you get the live stream. This is a Christian Urban Apologetics show where we serve the underserved and look into the overlooked, and rearranging the studio a little bit. No, it's not exactly how I want it, and no, I don't have the Doberman, the dog, with me today. You know, she's being all nosy, but here we are, and we're having a return guest to today's program on Street Apologist Live, Dr. Louis DeCaro Jr. We're going to be talking about, are the abolitionists bad guys? And were the Southern slave owners, were they the good guys? Or is it somewhere in between? What's going on? We're going to find out today. This is a response to a recent program that aired on Right Response Ministries. And I'm actually going to start with the first clip in just a second after I introduce Dr. Louis DeCaro Jr. to the audience once again. Welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir? Good to have you.
Good, thank you. Good to be with you. Good to be with you.
You still in New York? Still in New York these days?
Still in New York. Still here.
Are you born and raised in New York, Dr. DeCaro?
No. I'm a pastor's son. Grew up in a number of places, Western PA, Western New York. But I've been in New York City most of my life, or at least around New York City. So I've been here longer than any other place.
My mom was born in Warren, Pennsylvania.
I know of that.
Yeah. When I used to go visit her grandparents in that area, my grandpappy, as we called him, he had a spittoon. He'd watch TV while he had a spittoon there. And he said, well, it's time to go. And I didn't know what was going on. I was a kid. Every Saturday, he would go to some steakhouse. It was like a middle-class steakhouse. Don't get the wrong idea, but some steakhouse in New York. So as a kid, I was like, I've been in New York, but it's really confusing. It looks just like Pennsylvania. You know, I didn't understand the difference between the state and the city. I was a kid. But anyways, I imagine you may have been to that same steakhouse in New York. If I can find out what it was, maybe one day.
Maybe.
But thanks for coming on the program. Now, you are a professor, you're a historian, you specialize in abolitionism, things relating to the cultural environment in the United States of the Civil War, especially a hero, John Brown, who we've discussed on this program before. You've done, 5 books, I think? Edited letters, written on, is it 5 books on Brown or is it 4?
It's 5 books, but then I also throw in a couple of self-published things, but 5 books. I'll just put it this way. I think I've written more books than John Brown than anybody since they hanged him in 1859. A lot of people might not think that's a great thing to brag about, but that's my work. So.
Yeah, I think that might be the case. I got a couple back there I'll probably grab at some point during the show of your books. Yeah. And I listened to a whole bunch of your podcasts just this weekend. He runs a podcast called John Brown Today. And guys, listen, he is considering getting involved in social media. He's praying about it. He's thinking about it. So if you like what you hear from Dr. DeCaro Jr., I want you to encourage him and give him some ideas, what kind of content you'd like to see from him. It'd be interesting to see in the live chat what you guys have to say. But let's get right into this program. Here's the first clip. And Dr. DeCaro, I'm going to let you respond to it because this really sets up the whole show, this first clip. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen.
Ancient world and even in the pre-modern world, slavery was the option you wanted if you were in that situation because you don't want to die.
Right.
And I think it's worth pointing out that many of the slavers, we have records of this, there was a mercy that they had in there. I think of John Randolph, I mentioned earlier, who freed his slaves and sent them to Ohio, and they came running back. They wanted to be with him. And Robert E. Lee had an affection for his slaves. There was a willingness and a wanting to take care of them. Jefferson Davis, he basically adopted a young black boy as his slaves. And after the war, when they lost, his ex-slaves took him in to live with them. He was the one that fought in Congress so slaves could have patents, so they could actually make money on their own. I mean, the color that these things are being painted with is just not accurate. Wow. He was the one who led the Confederacy. So there is a love that existed there and a wanting to be a mercy to these people in bondage at times.
To land the plane, just for the listener, John and I, neither of us is saying that the South was without sin. We're talking about people. It's not that simple. It's complex. All people are sinners. So we're not saying that that all these people were, perfect saints with, pure spotless records and that they had never done anything wrong. But we are saying that the political propaganda narrative that's been played for decades now in our culture, in our nation, in our politics, that says, that it's just black and white, South bad, racist, and North good, abolitionist good, that is it's just not true. And understanding the history and understanding some of the
No, I know he didn't intend it, but it's an interesting pun. He says it's just black and white. It's not just black and white.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of is in more ways than one. Dr. DeCaro,
Yeah.
that's the essence of what their program was that they did recently. It was more than a week ago. It's got, I think, 7,000 views, so relatively well watched within a short amount of time, about 1,000 views a day or something like that, a little bit under. And the essence is, hey, it's more complicated, and we're not really so sure if the abolitionists were the good guys, and the Southerners were actually not so bad after all. What's your general take of that sentiment in that clip? Now, remember, we got 15 more clips to play, but go ahead.
Okay. I'll try to be succinct. Let me start with this pastor, I believe, who's the host.
Pastor Joel Webbin, yes, and he's interviewing John Harris. Yes, sir.
Yeah, let's credit at least acknowledging that, number one, slavery is a national institution with the founding of the country. So when you talk about all Southern slaveholders are bad, let's face it. I mean, Sojourner Truth was held as a slave in upstate New York by a Dutchman. So slavery is a U.S. institution, number one. The fact that it changed and was modified had to do with economics and other developments, but it's a U.S. institution. So number one. And number two, the North wasn't a great place for black people. Free black people had a terrible life. So I will give him that. The fact is that there are generalizations. There are kind of stereotypes that we get that we've inherited. But at the same time, of course, I think at the same time, that's, let's just say this. If slavery were kind of typified by the exceptions that the other brother is sharing, and those exceptions were no doubt real. You can find references. Certainly the pro-slavery press, like the Virginia newspapers, would have made a big deal about any enslaved person who had an opportunity to be free and then came back. That I've seen that in my research. But those are, if you're going to consider those as looking at the so-called propaganda or the so-called record, then you have to consider also all the people who ran away, all the insurrections, the small insurrections. You have to consider all the testimony of the slaves who, some of them had relationships with the people who made them their masters. But look at how many hated it. Look at how many people experienced abuse. I mean, for every one of those stories, there are 1,000 stories of people's lives scarred, of rapes, of unhappy families broken up, children torn away, and so the idea that somehow slavery has been misrepresented, and that now we need to see the kind of lighter, happier, sunny side of slavery. Come on, let's be real. We understand that the human condition is such that some people respond differently under bondage, just like some people respond differently under being kidnapped. Some people respond differently under all sorts of pressure situations. And yes, it also depends on the personality of the slaveholder. Let's be very clear about that. It's not that it's a conveyor belt and everything is the same. That's really not the point. The point you have to ask is slavery able to exist without the use of force, without the threat of violence, without legislation, without militias? If you can say that slavery would have gone on warmly with all these warm, happy relationships with these black people that are just so happy to be enslaved, if you can tell me that that's the normative nature of slavery, then why did they have all those features? Why was terror used? Why was violence used to secure slavery? I don't buy it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it in perspective. And, you're trying to be fair and have balance. And
Yes.
I appreciate that. And guys, this is the nature of the day's show, so it's sort of trigger warning for a lot of you out there. There's going to be a lot of things said from the interview and whatnot, and so I pray that you can get through it, because you'll be able to learn important history and hopefully a biblical perspective on these issues along the way. Shout out to my man Alan Torres. I'll hit you back about that question, and shout out to my bud Mark. Mark is a former Hebrew Israelite who's doing great these days, and it's beautiful to see. And lastly, Danny DeMint makes an interesting point. He says, Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt several times. Were God and Moses wrong? He's saying, it's like, okay, well, what does that all mean? Sometimes people want security instead of freedom. But what's right or wrong? And I think the point about violence being necessary is a good point. Here's the next clip in which I don't like this terminology. I understand it may be used in some circles where this slavery institution in the South is casually referred to as a labor relationship. And in other contexts, I've heard these guys say that some might find odious. It's like, come on, man. Let's call it what it is, man. All right, here's this clip.
Their society featured this labor relationship. That doesn't mean that the society was intrinsically fundamentally bad and on this level of Holocaust, which is basically what the post-war consensus basically made the Holocaust the worst thing ever, and now we're roping in all these other things. Slavery is just another Holocaust that happened in the United States. MAGA anti-immigration is now apparently another Holocaust, and so it's like this moral play that they keep doing, and I just don't want to let them do it. So
talk to us a little bit about where do you see the.
So there's the title of the program. I used one clip where you guys could see it. That way you would see what the program actually is. The rest are just going to have the video on the screen. But the title of the program that we are critiquing today on Street Apologist Live is Slavery, Abolitionists, and the Civil War with John Harris from Conversations That Matter. And both these gentlemen have a substantial following on YouTube, and we're interacting with some of the clips here with Dr. Louis DeCaro Jr. You want to comment on anything about that? I don't want to get too deep in modern politics with some of the stuff that's brought in, but a response to that, Dr. DeCaro.
Well, yeah, in fact, we'll stay away from any contemporary application. Just talk about slavery as a labor relation. One thing that I would like to point out, I've also taught in seminary and I've taught Christian history. And one of the things that I always tried to stress, because you can look at slavery, first of all, as this mammoth institution in history. There's always been slavery. I always told my students, slavery is the electricity of the ancient world. Without slavery, nothing runs. Okay. So when you look at slavery in the 19th century, especially you have the invention of the steam engine and you have a lot of technology developing, you start seeing that the rationale to keep people in bondage, number one, is more and more questionable. Number two, it's not a labor relation if the people don't want to work and don't want their labor to go to another man's table and they get virtually nothing. So why do you
say that's not a labor relation or a labor relationship? What do you mean by that? If you could flesh that out.
I mean, yeah, I think using labor as a relation is technically correct. I mean, you even find that if you look at one of the great theologians that I admire, John Murray, a Reformed theologian, when he was looking at slavery and his work on ethics, he tended to come down where, talking about slavery, it almost becomes a very technical, clinical way of looking at slavery. But we also have to keep in mind that that human beings were owned, and whether or not Jefferson Davis or Robert E. Lee ever raped a slave woman or even a slave man, I don't think that they did. But let's face it, a lot of people in slavery were raped, they were killed, they were treated like crap. They were not always well treated. Frederick Douglass says that in his first autobiography. So to simply call it labor relations, one thinks of, HR departments and employees. I'm not saying that there isn't a labor dynamic, but it's a dynamic that only goes one way. You work for me, I take the fruit of your labor.
Yeah.
And I feed you and give you the minimum of what you need. Well, that's where that expression "eating high on the hog" came from, because
Really?
slaveholders ate the best part of the hog.
Oh,
They ate high on the hog.
I
Right?
never knew that. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes it. That's why you have pig's feet and entrails as diet, as part of a diet. But which I knew that element, but I never knew the relationship to the phrase "eating high in the hog." Wow, that's fascinating. What, I've never used that phrase, but I'm going to be doubly sure not to use it now. Okay, this next one is interesting. Now, this is going to be your biggest temptation to go on, and I'm okay with that a little bit, because here we get into John Brown territory. So this wasn't a focus of the show, but I had to clip this out for you. And in my limited understanding, I found it interesting. I feel like John made almost, I'm going to call it a Freudian slip, I don't know, where he says slaveocracy. Such an interesting phrase that he utilized there. And I don't really, I don't find charitable, I'll put it that way, the ways he describes what John Brown was trying to do. But this is all very interesting, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. And guys, again, if you don't understand, I'm talking to Dr. Louis DeCaro. He's got some great books on John Brown. Here's one, The Cost of Freedom, and this is from Brown's Life and Letters. And I heard you talk about how there's a lot of boring stuff in here, but because it's day to day. But, a lot of what John Brown wanted to do was to see his kids come to Christ. And there's a lot of evangelizing that takes place in John Brown's letters. And that's a fascinating thing. John Brown was an evangelist in a lot of ways, to his own family as well. And then Fire from the Midst of You. This is a very important overlooked aspect here of John Brown, his religious life. And just in case you guys don't know, he was a rock-ribbed Calvinist. And he was an avid reader and what we might even call an amateur theologian. And that's my man Brown. So here we go, talking about John Brown in relationship to this question on the program. Here we go.
Degrees of what they wanted to do about that. The most extreme cases, I suppose, being John Brown and the Secret Six who financed him wanting to start slave insurrections and kill white people in the South and form even perhaps a slaveocracy, not a slaveocracy, but an empire or a region that slaves controlled, former slaves. And these kinds of things obviously scared the South in many ways. And there was a postal crisis in the 1830s where millions of pamphlets from abolitionists went down south, and some of them encouraged this kind of thing, to start an uprising. Don't work for your masters, disobey really the Bible on these points, kill your masters. And there's some actual minor insurrections that happened that were influenced by this kind of thinking. And so that scared the South. But these were the abolitionists the Southerners didn't like. And so if you look at the preceding the Civil War during the federal period, so up through like up till 1840 almost, you had way more anti-slavery institutions or organizations in the South than in the North. And by the time the war happened,
there's so much there. We might even have to play that clip again. Listen, one thing that was interesting, he said, those are the abolitionists that the South didn't like. Which are the abolitionists that the South was liking? I guess he's trying to say the gradual emancipators, which I find a problematic concept and term. And, people should be aware that the old school abolitionists were more about gradualism. But as they saw this is not going to go away, it's entrenched, they said no, abolition. And the so-called radical abolitionists said emancipation without recompense. And that was the most odious idea of all, of course. One of the odious ideas to the South. And just fascinating stuff there. What's your reaction to that? You seemed maybe impressed by some of the elements culturally he knew. Maybe, but
I mean, I'm not. I'm glad that I'm a little older and less reactionary, and try to be sympathetic when I hear people talk, because I don't want to impute the base motives. And having said that, I think this brother John seems like he's a student, and he's learning and seeking, and so am I. But having said that, I hope that he would read more than just, my guess is that he's read Otto Scott's biography on John Brown on this. It's called The Secret Six. It's kind of the go-to book for the very conservative, oftentimes very sympathetic. I'm trying to use language. I don't know what the best, kindest language would be for people who are sympathetic with the Confederacy, neo-Confederates, paleo-Confederates, whatever you want to call them. They love Otto Scott's book on John Brown. It's really a paid assassin book. It's not a good biography, although it's proficiently written. Otto Scott was a professional historian. He worked for companies, organizations, industry, and he didn't like John Brown, and so he wrote this book in the 1960s or 70s. I have it somewhere in the back of my shelf. It's not a book that's really good for anything. So when he says, for instance, that John Brown and the Secret Six wanted to organize insurrections, that's false. Now, that's not his fault, because the whole story. Now, you talk about propaganda. I have an axe to grind too, as a historian, as a biographer. I've been looking at this stuff for 25 years, and I know what John Brown wanted to do, and I know that he didn't want to start an insurrection. What is an insurrection? Very briefly, it's when slaves rise up and kill their masters. Not just their masters, they kill their masters' children, because their children become their masters if they kill their masters. John Brown did not want to engage in insurrectionary violence. He wanted to destabilize slavery throughout the South. So I won't take the time to go into it, but the reality is that John Brown was not doing. Why do we think he was an insurrectionist? Because what is the first draft of history? The first draft of history is newspapers. What were the newspapers that gave us the first interpretation of John Brown? The Southern press and the pro-slavery New York press, because they wouldn't let anyone else in to see or talk to John Brown after they captured him.
Can I comment on that briefly? Because I've listened to you, so I'm not just interjecting random stuff. Yeah. You told the story in one of your podcasts about basically, I don't know if we want to call him a spy journalist from the North, who was registered as a Democrat, so he appeared to have bona fides, was the point, to be able to be in there. And if it wasn't for him, we would have very little accurate reporting. Specifically, now I'm talking about the elements of the trial and whatnot relating to John Brown, and actually even what happened. If it wasn't for him, we would know very little, and it offsets a lot of the propaganda that was out of the South. And he was a fascinating character. And so I think sometimes it's like some of these pro-Southern and sympathizers, it's almost like they read Southern propaganda, add a little bit of nuance to it, and then accuse the North of the propaganda and just believe basically old school Southern propaganda. That's sometimes the sense I get.
Yeah. Precisely. That's exactly it. It's a reheated old stuff, reheated. And yeah, you talk about Ned House, who was a New York Daily Tribune theater critic of all people, but as you said, he had his credentials. He was undercover, and another journalist said in retrospect that the freedom of the press was effectively destroyed during John Brown's imprisonment, and the reason why, until they executed him, was because Virginia did not want the truth to get out about the impact that he had. They often tell you that, quote unquote, the slaves did not react. The truth is that there were hundreds that were ready. The truth is that there was potential there, strong potential, and he would have succeeded had he himself gotten out of Harper's Ferry in time. I don't want to make this more about John Brown, but simply, again, to point out, as you're saying, that a lot of times what they're really doing, what these two brothers are doing, and again, I don't want to attribute any malicious intent, but I think that they think that they're balancing the books.
Right.
And I think that what we have to point out to them is that, yeah, there may be certain tendencies on the part of secular historians, as Christian believers, we don't have the same presuppositions going into history as you hear a lot of times in universities. We believe in the lordship of Christ, and we believe in the scriptures, but at the same time, for instance, the idea that all abolitionists were the same, this is a very old charge. In fact, R.L. Dabney, who was one of the much loved Reformed Presbyterian Southern fathers.
These guys still like him. They still like him. In
Yeah.
fact, I'm going to play a clip. I might even make it the next clip since you brought him up, where they mention him, and it's pretty wild. But go ahead. Yeah, these guys still love him.
Yeah.
He's like a hero, you know.
Oh yeah,
Dabney,
yeah. And, you know,
Dabney good, Garrison bad.
Exactly. Well, you know, I got to say that from the standpoint of being a Christian believer and a person with a reformed background and training, and I found actually evidence that William Lloyd Garrison, who is considered maybe the father of abolitionist orators, and I think a lot of the abolitionists, some of them started off as evangelicals, like William Lloyd Garrison. They eventually moved to the left and abandoned, I think, a high view of Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And in that much, I will agree with these brothers in critiquing them. And as I was, you know, Dabney used to refer to these guys, I'm talking about in the 1870s when he was writing in retrospect, he called them Jacobins because I guess in those days they couldn't call him a Marxist. They didn't have that language yet.
Oh, okay.
So in those days, you called somebody a Jacobin if you wanted to just dismiss them. But I want to point out that there were also strong Bible-believing and even Reformed people, especially, I hope these brothers will look at the Covenanters. These are the Scottish Covenanters who were against any form of bondage servitude, even going back to the 1600s. And when they came to the United States, they were against chattel slavery.
And that probably comes out of their experience of dealing with the oppression of the British. Would that be part of it?
Well, as Scots, yes, and seeing all form of oppression, and yes, it was their political experience, but they consistently saw as Christians the problems with slavery, and the person to look at is Alexander MacLeod, who was a Scottish pastor who actually was right here in New York City where I live. In 1802, he wrote a book called "Negro Slavery is Unjustifiable." I think that's the term. I wrote it down somewhere, but MacLeod argued from the scriptures. He argued from a biblical rationale. So my point is that, you know, these gentlemen are kind of saying, well, you know, all these abolitionists, they were all kind of liberals, all kind of, you know, this is an old argument and there's some truth in it. But the truth, you know, just like, you know, I think, did they mention Martin Luther King in some way? Negative?
Yeah, I'm going to play that. That'll be the next clip there for you.
Yeah. They want to critique, you know, it's a selective critique. It's kind of like, oh, you know, the pro-slavery people, they were good Christians and their slaves loved them. And, you know, and all these liberals then and now, Martin Luther King, these people, you know, they didn't have they weren't this and they weren't that. But the reality, what we're really concerned for is what was the best, most appropriate direction that the country could take with respect to human beings. Yeah. And this is what John Brown said when he was in court. He said, I appeal to the golden rule. Now, I simply want to ask, if you really love and treat people as you would have them treat you, then what kind of a labor relationship are you going to have with them? What kind of a social relationship? So I don't buy it. I understand that and again, I don't want to attack people because I can't judge their souls. And I think in some ways on the younger set of this, like Brother John, he's not an older guy. He's not defending something that he grew up in and he wants to keep, you know, black people in their place. I think he's kind of thinking that maybe, you know, we've been hearing all these liberals and it's time for us to, you know, straighten things out. And I'm here to say, just because liberals say it doesn't mean it's not true. Yeah. And the record of slavery is ugly. Yeah, it's very ugly.
John's actually a New Yorker, believe it or not. You know,
okay.
Yeah, a few things, such fascinating stuff. You know, there sometimes is a separation, unfortunately, between a good theology and good practice, and people can overblow that. I understand, but even Jesus, you know, talks about, well, look at this Roman centurion's faith. I haven't found anything like this inside of Israel. And he did that a number of times where he went out of his way in his own encounters and also drawing from Old Testament examples, such as Naaman, the Syrian, and the widow, and people like this to say, you know, you guys are doing better than the Israelites in your trust in God. Now, their theology may not have been as good as the Pharisee that Jesus criticized, who've been trained in the scriptures, ever since they were a young kid and knew multiple languages and had access to scribes. Okay, that's true. But, now I'm switching eras here, but you think about Naaman. Naaman said, well, can I take some of this dirt? And the prophet said, yeah, go ahead. Now, that had some pagan presuppositions attached to it, him asking for the dirt. And he said, that way when I have to go into the temple of my master, of this false god, basically, you guys should read the story. It's fascinating what this conversation Naaman has afterwards. But the point is, the practice is I think that's, now we ideally we want both. And that's why we point out the Covenanters. That's why we point out, John Brown's theology was very Calvinistic. And so I do think that's helpful. Now, this quote is going to boil some people's blood, because this is going to take the theme we've been talking about and make it way more stark. Here we go. Guys, buckle up.
Like, I think a lot of people are going to be surprised, when you get to heaven and, you're spending eternity worshiping Christ next to Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee and Jonathan Edwards, and George Whitefield and Martin Luther King Jr. is in hell. Like, I firmly believe that. I think a lot of people are going to be really frustrated when they realize that there were a lot of good men. Well,
and most of the abolitionists are probably going to be, the prominent ones are not going to be in heaven, right, because they denied things like the Trinity and the inspiration of Scripture and that kind of thing.
They weren't the good guys.
They weren't the good guys.
Which is crazy. No. And that's something for me that, that's how I started off this episode, was by saying that, okay.
So this is what I'm talking about. They're criticizing Northern propaganda is oversimplifying. And then they say, well, they weren't the good guys. And most of the abolitionists are going to be in hell. Now, he kind of corrected himself and said, well, the prominent ones. But he started off, John Harris, the expert on the topic, starts off with most of the prominent ones. What? But now here's the thing. If you want to say, okay, I think so-and-so, because of their views, it looks like they wouldn't meet the qualifications of born again Christian. Okay, I guess. But then to automatically say, but I know that Dabney and Lee, they've got a ticket, though. I know that. That clip could probably go viral if I really wanted to play with it and say, look at this. But I don't think I'm going to do that. But my goodness, that's... Yeah. By the way, quick shout out to Salvation for All for the super chat, and my man Yandel, a.k.a. Alan Torres from Nevada. Thank you for the super chats. Now, you can respond to that one however you want, because that one did make me kind of angry.
Yes, yeah. I think that, first of all, it takes a certain amount of either unthinking and recklessness, or some kind of, maybe, my view of the pastor here in this case, I have to be a bit more critical for him to put Martin Luther King Jr. in hell just like that. Number one, we all know that Christ is going to judge the living and the dead. And we have the warning of the Lord Jesus that people will stand before him and say, I did this and I did this. And he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. And that is a sword that cuts not just both ways, but in every direction. So let's be careful about who we place in hell. That might be okay for Dante Alighieri and the Divine Comedy to put his enemies in hell as a little satire. But the assurance, the audacity even to say that King is in hell. Yeah, King was a sinful man, but it's interesting to me that I hear people from this side of the world, the way they reason is all the grace is given to the people that they want to accept. But Martin Luther King goes to hell. This is why when they celebrated, I think his the fifth, was it in 2018, the 50th anniversary. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Even some of the people like John Piper who went there got criticized because they wanted to remember King, and there were people on the internet saying terrible things about King, and at the same time, look at somebody not, and I'm willing to consider. Look, Jonathan Edwards was a slaveholder. He had a little boy, a little child named Titus. He had a young woman named Venus. I don't know whether he molested Venus. I don't think he did. I think he was a godly man. And I think the framework of his thinking was such that he thought slavery was a legitimate. As a matter of fact, Edwards is really kind of weird because he's against the African slave trade, but he believes in domestic slavery. Go figure that out. That's an interesting
how do you
point.
have both things? Yeah.
Yeah, but he felt like since they're here, it's better that kind of, we help them. And I think these guys probably have that attitude too, that, they needed to be helped and all this kind of nonsense, which is, again, it's slave master, it's old slaveholder propaganda. But I want to point out
white man's burden, right? White man's burden redux.
Exactly. Now, just some things about R.L. Dabney, the beloved of the Reform set in the South. When I was at Westminster, we had his systematic theology. Everybody loves Dabney. But to me, there's a good chance if I'm going to be I'm not being serious, I'm being tongue in cheek, that if you put King in hell, brother, I'm going to put Dabney next to him. Because
why is that?
You know why? Because Dabney had the advantage of retrospect. He lived into the later night. Like, for instance, James Henley Thornwell died during the Civil War. So if he was wrong, and I believe he was in his assessment of slavery, he died before he could view slavery after the end, after the South's defeat, after slavery. He didn't have an opportunity to revisit history. But
Thornwell, we had to read him in seminary, and he was. I'm not saying the seminary, but the textbooks and whatnot described him as not. I don't want to use the word benighted, but a little more enlightened or fair. Where they have souls. We should be fair. But we've all got our place in life, type of thing, and that was actually considered a somewhat superior position to some of the other worst versions of. Well, actually, we're not even dealing with humans or something like that. But yeah, it's interesting you brought him up. He's probably almost like the best. If someone says, okay, what's the best, most theologically reformed, robust defense of slavery that was offered at that time, I think probably Thornwell will be the guy to read. I would say. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah. I'm just making sure.
No, that's good.
I'm still here, guys.
Yeah.
Go ahead, brother.
It's good. And so I'd actually be more patient. In other words, I'm going to extend there's a historian that said the golden rule is not just for the living, it's for the dead.
Right.
So I try to extend as a historian the golden rule. I'm getting wiser as I get older. But the reason why I think Dabney goes to hell, okay, facetiously speaking, is because he's a liar, and he's a liar after the fact. He misrepresents the entire reality of the history of the South and slavery, and he does this in the 70s. He does this, and as far as I'm concerned, he died unrepentant with respect to his role. So God will judge him, but personally for me, I wouldn't have Dabney's work in my home, in my library, precisely not because he erred in his life or he sinned in his life. Because look, let's face it, if we start down that road, nobody lasts. Nobody's, and if it's not a formal theological error, it's a personal error. So I think we have to grant grace. But when you see somebody like Dabney who says these things, he writes in his Defense of Virginia, 1867, he defends the moral character of domestic slavery, quote unquote, meaning the, quote, obligations of the slave to labor for life without his own consent for the master, end quote. That's his words. Dabney differs with the abolitionist view of slavery, which is that slavery converts the being into a mere thing, a chattel. What does he mean? He differed with that. That was the law. That was the law that the South wanted, a commodity. He insists that Southern slavery treats the slave as a rational human being and gives the master property and nothing but his labor. Now, and this kind of stuff is the stuff that misled the Scottish theologian Murray that I was talking about, because they take these people at their word,
right,
but they don't realize that what they're representing, it's a false witness.
Right.
Later on, he said this. He said that black people were. Where do I have this? Oh, he said, this is what he said in 1876. Black men should not get the right to vote. 1876. He said that blacks were aliens to the soil of the country and were, quote, naturally indolent.
What's the word indolent
Okay.
mean? That's a new one for me. Indolent.
Lazy, shiftless. They don't
Siri,
take.
How do you
they
define
don't-
indolent?
Yeah.
Isn't it funny to hear a European talking about they're not native to the soil? You're okay.
Yeah,
You're right.
exactly.
Habitually lazy. That's what indolent means. It means habitually lazy. It's
Habitually
funny.
lazy. Yeah.
They're habitually lazy, and yet we'll put them to work for 16 hours a day.
That's right.
But I know what
right.
they would say. Well, that's because we're forcing them to. I don't know. Yeah, Dabney.
Yeah, but yet it's all love. It's all love, though. You see how it's all love. I mean, these slaves really loved their masters. They even ran away and came back most of the time. These are the ideas they get. But the reality is, it was a system of violence and terror, and that's how it ran. And he says blacks are a subservient race made to follow, not to lead.
And it's like, you're a systematic theologian. Where do you get that in your systematic theology? Where do you get
He didn't
anything?
even want, brother. He didn't even want whites to ordain blacks in ministry if he could avoid it. This is in his own writing. I got this from reading him.
This guy.
But you put king in hell. You put king in hell.
Yeah. Well, let's find out. Here's the genteel, benign, courteous view that the South had, and they're just so responsible and concerned about the future, whereas the Northerners are irresponsible. Listen to this clip.
And I mean, in the debate that I just referenced with Jay Blanchard, also it came up, and they essentially say that we're downstream from this. Like I said, Dabney said it was an iniquitous traffic, and at the point in which we are now, we have to deal with those who are sometimes generations into it. And so you have slaves who they've only known life in the United States at the time, and maybe their great-great-grandfather or something was the one who was sold in Africa. What do you do? What's the easy solution to that? Do you return this person to a place they have absolutely no connection to, except that's the land of their ancestors, but now they know it.
Right, just drop them off in the jungle on the other side of the world.
Yeah, and Liberia was a failed experiment, really. In that, do you just free them into a vacuum?
Okay, sorry. That started.
And I mean, and
that clip there, John is focusing on something that he focuses on a lot in these clips. If you go through the whole show, and it's an idea of, okay, well, we're already in this situation. We're not the ones who are responsible for the kidnapping. So what do we do now? And Joel Webbin's more incendiary, in my opinion. What do you do? Just drop them off in the jungle? And it's like, I just like, come on, man. And it's bizarre to me. They have no connection to, except it's a land of their ancestors. Hello, Egypt. Hello, Pharaoh. Hello, Israelites. Hello, Canaan and Abraham. What am I saying, y'all? What was the connection for the Israelites of Moses' day to the land of Canaan, other than their father Abraham 400 some years earlier? These guys are literally making arguments that could double for Pharaoh's court magicians. Come on now. Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah. Real sleight of hand stuff. I mean, first of all, this brother John, he's giving you two options. He's giving you options, but doesn't include freeing them until he classifies it as freeing them into a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that even mean? What John Brown's position was, what do you give? Give them free. What are you going to do with them? I'm going to set them free, because as human beings, they needed to be free. So the assumptions here is that the only thing you can do with a black person is either ship them back to Africa and they're not going to make it there, or keep them in slavery here, because Lord knows we can't set them free into a vacuum, because they would just die without us.
They like the word gradual emancipation. That's what they say. Well, the Southerners were into gradual emancipation, which is coded as responsible, thoughtful, caring emancipation.
Yes. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
quick question
Well,
on
the
that.
interesting
Quick.
thing is the North did.
Say what?
I was going to say the North did gradual emancipation. Why didn't the South?
Yeah. The
The
North.
North did it.
The North, for all its foibles, because no one is saying the North is
Yeah.
a paradise for these kind of relationships, but nonetheless they did. That's a fact. Good point. And now someone might say, well, there's the other factors. Well, then okay, then are you ever going to do it or not? Okay, if you're going to bring in, well, the agrarian society versus industrial. Okay, but are you going to do it or not? Now, I read when I was getting into this, and I tried to look this up before today's program. I wasn't able to stumble upon it again, about proposals bandied about, and I thought it was by people acting in official capacity. And if you don't know about this, or I'm off on a limb, that's okay. That either right before the secession or during sometime, there was elements of a discussion about annexing, I forget where it was, but I think I'm going to say it's an island somewhere in the Caribbean, to become a place that became essentially a slave breeding island, where then the South would get slaves from there since the slave trade itself had ended. And this was bandied about. And I brought this up in a former broadcast, but I lost track of the source, so I got to go find it again. And my point by saying all that was, I got indications when I've been looking at this, that plenty of Southerners, especially ones in important positions, wanted this to go on in perpetual. There was an idea if we're going to gradually emancipate, like these guys are saying. They say this is established by the Bible or whatever other reason they would give, and so it should go on into perpetuity. How do you say that word, perpetuity? I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but if you could speak to that, because I don't know if it's the case that all of them were into this gradual emancipation. I didn't really find that there, but I don't know. Help me out. Where's the balance here?
Well, I mean, gradual emancipation is not something, again, that's not something the South was known for. What the South did have some truck in was the American Colonization Society. It was that early attempt to ship out Africans. And both anti-slavery and pro-slavery people kind of came together around the ACS, the American Colonization Society. I'm talking about in the early 1800s. The problem was, of course, and I think maybe somebody in this conversation agreed or said something like this. But the fact is that blacks were not necessarily welcome in the North. And so the idea was to ship them out. Okay. But the problem was with that is that it was not going to be done justly. And it was going to be done again for white people. And the white people that didn't want colonization the most were the slaveholders. Okay. So you don't have that. What you have to get to the point is that what the South really wanted to do was expand territory. And I would say, as you're saying, Vocab, they didn't want to just expand territory, because I think Brother John in one of these clips says, "Oh, they didn't want to expand; they just wanted to move their enslaved people to the territories."
Yeah, he made it seem like it wasn't an actual expansion of slavery, as if they're just basically transferring their property, or I'm taking my luggage into Kansas now.
Yeah. No. That I'm afraid I got to disagree with. They wanted to do. As a matter of fact, we know that's the one thing Lincoln would not give them, and that's what they were triggered for secession, and is that he said you can keep slavery, but you got to stay where you are. You can't expand. What did they want to do? They wanted to expand. Why do you think Texas was taken?
Yeah.
Who took? I'm going to get Texans angry at me, but they took it for the land, and they took it to put slavery on it. They wanted to grow slavery. It was profit driven.
And it's fascinating that you could have these border ruffians in a place like Bleeding, Kansas, who were actually the minority and were kind of encroaching on territory where it was non-slave holding peoples, and were trying to upset the democratic process because it was left up to the states at that point. And so it's not like the South, because I don't see how you disassociate the border ruffians and all that from the South. It's not like they were like, well, we'll just let it play out how it's supposed to go. No, this was going to be done by force, And so, right. I mean, we see what's going on here, and I just don't want to soft sell this. I just really don't think we should soft sell this. And if people say, well, this war, it wasn't really about such and such. Well, Here's what they say the war is about when it comes to the Civil War.
Separation of the states and so forth. But the war itself, if we're just talking about the war, it was a response to an invasion.
So there's the short clip, but hold on, I got another one. It's a little more in depth where he talks about this. Just give me a second where to go. Is this it? Okay, I think this is it here, where he talks about it, I think.
Gradualism, Northern higher criticism units.
I don't think this is the right one. But this is actually an interesting one that relates to other issues regarding the Civil War. So we're going to talk about causes here, but let me play this clip first, people.
Gradualism, Northern higher criticism, Unitarianism, all these things do factor in. There's cultural clashes going on even before slavery, or I should say abolitionism really becomes an issue. But ultimately the wars comes down to we're going to defend ourselves against an invasion.
Going back to something
a few things there. First of all, when abolition became a problem, he corrected himself. It wasn't that slavery was a problem. The abolitionists became the problem. The abolitionists, they became the problem, and that's what caused this. Plus, they were all liberals. They were all. This is returning to an earlier theme. So it was really about higher criticism and inerrancy and those kinds of issues. And this is just. It's hard not to call this. Now, I know what will happen when they watch this. Oh, they're dismissing it as lost cause narrative. But it's hard not for me to say that sounds like some lost cause myth stuff. Right? But if you want to comment on that, Brother DeCaro.
Yeah. Well, look, number one, there were different issues. We've heard these lines about, slavery was the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. It was all these different causes. I would argue that slavery is the hub, and even if there are other issues related like tariffs and states' rights, all these things really don't have any significance apart from the slave states as they became in the antebellum era, with their interests and their institutional and political interests all working like a finely honed machine. Dominating Washington, D.C., making sure everything worked the way they wanted to work. And then if they couldn't get their way, they always had Plan B in their back pocket. We know that, for instance, South Carolina threatened with secession over tariffs in the 1850s. Come on. We know what the real deal was. They were protecting their economy.
It's a pretense. It's kind of like, Vladimir Putin. These are Russian-speaking peoples. They want to be part of Mother Russia. Therefore, we'll invade them to liberate them. Yes. It's like, no, bro, it's clearly a pretense. It's a pretense.
And what they wanted was not just slavery. They wanted to expand. They wanted to, if you're going to expand territory, you want to expand the number of people in slavery. So you're not only going to try to multiply the slaves you have, but yes, if you go into, as you said, I think it was Nicaragua, or they wanted to go, because they had a filibuster way back in the 1850s, a guy who went down there with a bunch of men, and he was down in, I think, in Central America. What they were trying to get more enslaved black people. Why? They wanted to build an economic empire, because that was the only way that they knew how to survive. And they had tensions with the North. And yes, there was hypocrisy in the North. The North was making money, the insurance companies, the banks, the businesses. And by the way, John Brown knew this. John Brown didn't give the North a break. He wasn't a Northern guy. He was an anti-slavery guy. So, there's definitely stuff on both sides here, but let's face it. The South was doing what the South wanted to do, and it wasn't an invasion that, that's the spark. And even if you can call it an invasion, but the reality is that the South had a plan. If they didn't get what they wanted when Lincoln was elected, and even though Lincoln, he's not the figure we've been told either. He's like Frederick Douglass said to a bunch of white people once. He said he was predominantly your president, not ours. Okay, that's just the truth of it.
Yeah, I feel like, was it you? You kind of you kind of teased. I forget if it was a biographer or whatever. I swear it was in your podcast. You called him Lincoln worshipping.
Yes, I call it Lincoln priesthood. There's a Lincoln priesthood out there. Believe me, I'm an academic who studies John Brown. They hate John Brown. So I get it from the Southerners, and the reform guys in the South, and I get it from the liberals in the gatekeeping community.
Yeah.
That they love Lincoln. Lincoln.
Yeah. I mean, people should know Lincoln. As John Harris answered, I think we can rightly call him a white supremacist. But being a white supremacist abolitionist is better than being a white supremacist slave master. I'm just saying, if you gotta pick your poison here. Yeah. And then not only that, right. John Brown was much more consistent than most more Northerners. He was much more thorough, and he lived what he said. And it's beautiful when you read how he treated people in his actual daily life and the kind of character he had. And, just kind of on a tangent, but these guys, talking about Lincoln, I almost kind of think a guy we should make more of a hero out than we should have is the guy on the $50 bill, Grant. Grant did inherit a slave, and he didn't sell that slave. He let him go. That's at a cost to himself. My understanding, when he did it, the slave markets were high, and meaning he could have got a lot. And he wasn't a time where Grant was established himself. He didn't have a lot himself, and yet he let the man go. And so you compare that to Lee, who inherited slaves, and yet they try to hold him up as this paragon of virtue. He
couldn't afford to let them go.
Yeah. No one could. The poor guys at the poor plantations, they can't afford. I mean, isn't that what Pharaoh said? Who's gonna run the shops? Who's gonna make the bricks? Right. Let these guys go. It's just like, guys, whenever you hear these arguments, just put them in the mouth of Pharaoh's court magicians. Right. And I'm saying magicians kind of as a slap. Obviously, it would be probably his advisors and whatnot. But you guys understand what I'm going for? Okay, so listen to this. This relates to the causes, and we're not going to spend the whole time on this, but it relates. He brings up the Virginia secession, and people brought this out before, and he's like, well, they didn't even mention slavery. And of course, the point is they didn't need to. Everybody had already done it by then. Now, to John's credit, he did mention that other secession documents did. But it just sounds selective in this clip. And I think people should understand what a lot of these documents, the secession documents, I don't know what the technical term is, what they said and didn't say. Virginia being, I think, an exception. But here we go with this clip.
Thought that. But they wanted to respond to Lincoln's force. So you don't see anything about slavery, for example, in Virginia's secession declaration. It's really just a response to Lincoln has called up arms. We're going to join the people who have left because we don't want to live in a country like that. So
we don't want to live in a country like that. Imagine what the slaves are thinking, John. Do they want to live in, what kind of country do they want to live in? The enslaved person. So bizarre,
Right.
I just don't know how the South can make it, But on that, so Virginia doesn't bring up slavery, I guess, in their secession document. What say you?
Well, they don't need to at that point. I mean, they actually waited. Virginia and South Carolina were really the main engines, in a sense, for the political people in Virginia were strongly in favor of secession. The governor who was presiding at the time of secession, whose name just escapes me, it'll come back to me in a second. The governor just before him was Henry Wise, who was the one who made sure systematically he killed John Brown and all of his men instead of putting him in prison. He was for secession, and Lecter, I think the name was the guy who succeeded him. He held off, and Virginia really waited because the first secession, I think, was toward the end of December. That was South Carolina. Of course, South Carolina was the spearhead. And then there were all the other deep South slave states that seceded. And Virginia was waiting to see what was going to happen because they were, the Old Dominion. They had some kind of skin in the game of the Union that the other states didn't have. And they wanted to wait and see what would happen. And when they saw that it was turning that way, that's when they seceded. So they didn't need to. And I think in some ways that doesn't speak well of the politicians of Virginia. It shows hypocrisy that they didn't make that the issue, that they were just sort of following. And you get this whole idea, well, Robert E. Lee, he was a statesman. He didn't really want to break with the Union. He just loved Virginia more, and Virginia loved the South. And so that's kind of this sleight of hand. But the reality is they knew what they wanted and they did it. And if they didn't want to do it, they wouldn't have done it, because there were slave states that didn't secede. Missouri didn't secede. Kentucky didn't secede.
Why is that? I mean, this is kind of taking us off. I'm sorry, but actually, why is that? What's the reason? Do you know?
Because they valued the Union and believed in the Union, and they were hoping that if they did have to give up slavery, they would be compensated. But at the same time, they were willing to put their place in the Union above their economic interests. Now, maybe arguably they didn't have as much money tied up in slavery. They weren't as strong because they were the states right on the border going in. Oftentimes they were right on the edge of the North. But the point is that, these people did what they wanted to do. They were traitors. They betrayed the country. They left the Union, and they did it for economic and political gain. And anything else they want to say about it is really just the propaganda. And I think that's probably the place where we're going to reach, we're going to reach an impasse with these brothers, because as long as they see the response of the South as justifiable, as well-meaning, as defensible, then they're like Dabney. They're lying about the past. And that's where I would draw the line. I can see why you can try to argue here and there why there were exceptions and this and that and blah, blah, blah. But when you start telling me that secession wasn't secession, that it wasn't rebellion, and that the people who really were responsible for the Civil War was the North because it invaded the South, give me a break.
Yeah, good word. Well, what they say is if you just would have given enough time, the South would have emancipated them. Here we go with that.
Most of them, I would say, were gradual emancipationists of some stripe. They wanted to get rid of the institution. And there's some proof I can go through.
Is that
proof for the future?
Is that true? If you just get them time, they would have got rid of slavery. Is that true?
Well, you know what they might have done, because they actually came up with a better plan that worked for them after Reconstruction. They didn't have slavery, but they still had slaves.
Yeah.
They didn't have chattel slavery anymore, but they sure treated those folks like the scum of the earth. As a matter of fact, they had them under sharecropping. They had them, they took away all the progress they made during Reconstruction. So we know what the South was capable of. It was a violent, and I want to point this out again. Slavery was an inherently violent and wicked institution. It was based on terrorism. And the reason why we have violence in our culture today is in no small part due to the amount of violence that was necessary to sustain a culture of slavery.
Let me tell you something.
A lot of violence.
Dr. DeCaro, in a number of clips, they tie in modern day problems of violence and whatnot with the way that the North liberated slaves, meaning they think that's what poisoned race relations, is the way that the North did it. They say this a number of times in here, and to me it's just so shocking. I'm just like, don't you think the problem might have been the initial slavery? Not. I don't think the way that the people were released was the main issue here.
Absolutely.
My goodness.
Absolutely. Whatever worked for them is good. These are the people that when Reconstruction was ended, when Black people were betrayed by the Republican Party and they pulled the troops out in the 1870s, and immediately white Southerners took their vengeance and took control and used violence. When that happened in Alabama, the white folks down there, they called that redemption. So how do you deal with a people whose idea of redemption, idea of their economic, political, and social stability is based on keeping Black people under their feet? That is a culture that was born out of a century or more of chattel slavery. And so any notion that slavery was anything less than a violent institution that warped the minds and lives of people and influenced our country for the worst, to me, is just a lot of slow, precious, you know what. I'm sorry. Just can't accept it.
Yeah.
It's not historically sound.
The way I hear these gentlemen usually approach those issues is they basically frame those problems as exceptions. But there's some times where they admit that some of these things did happen. Listen to this.
It's too late, but there's a mechanism for slaves, if they join the Confederacy, to eventually gain their freedom. So they had the moral capability and will to eventually get rid of this. But it was a complex situation. I think, as Thomas Jefferson said, he wanted to diffuse slaves in the Western territories, and he thought that's where they would gain independence. They wouldn't suffer from some of the racial abuse, or I should say, just being a different people living among others who don't share everything in common. They could go out to an area where they could claim it as their own and build their own society. But that's what the Republican Party wanted to prevent. So they were kind of like bottled up in this.
Again, the problem is the Republicans here, of course, according to this.
Yeah.
And so the South had the moral will, if you just would have given them time. I mean, there's just a lot there in that clip that I think we can say was objectionable, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, you hear the language of complexity. This is a thing that you always hear, and you hear this. You heard this about South African apartheid. You hear this. This is what people who are working from a framework of oppression, how they think. I'm not saying this brother's an oppressor. I'm saying, though, he's working from a framework of oppression. And so he's arguing that they had the moral will to do this, when in fact, as soon as they had the opportunity, they had no moral will. They had only a desire to kill. And that's when the lynchings and the violence began to take place again. That's when Jim Crow legislation, both de jure and de facto laws, laws were put into practice, keeping black people down. What will did they have that wasn't about getting on top of these Africans, because they saw them as foreigners? They saw them as not like us, except for when you wanted to have sex with them, because that's what they were doing all the time. And
he says they'll say that's an exception, but that's a good point, because even in there, he said, well, it's not really racial abuse. It's just living around people that are different than you. But I mean, I think his first inclination to describe it as examples or cases of racial abuse is accurate, because some of these guys have an aversion to the concept of like, well, this could be racial or whatnot. And I understand the categories, whatever. But of course it was. But go ahead. I like what you're saying there. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this is a story. I've had black people from the South tell me this. I think Malcolm X relayed this. It's I think it's interesting rule of thumb, and that is, black people often will say that if I was around a good Southern man, I'd rather be around him than to be with a hypocritical Northern white man. Okay, but the problem was, how many good Southern white men were there? And so again, we can play around in this field of exceptions and talk about the kind slave masters or the people who wanted to do the right thing. But the reality is, the South historically shows us what they were about. And I want to stress, the only reason why the North didn't do this is because the North had economic imperatives to change. I'm not crediting. Plus, they had New England, and they had a different attitude in some of the colonies against slavery. But let's face it, the Southern history shows us what the Southern will was about. It was about slavery. It was about labor, stolen black bodies, and it was about getting them back underfoot as soon as they could, and about not letting go until Martin. Okay, we can't talk about Martin because he's in hell, but Martin Luther King is the one who represents what's on the other end of this ugly process of the will on the part of white Southerners. So the reality is, there were a lot of white Southerners, but there were white Southerners who spoke against us, to be sure. Just like there were a lot of white people in the North who were no darn good. But the reality is that as a collective society, the South knew exactly what they wanted, and they did what they wanted, and they didn't let go until they had to let go. because that's the nature of sin. And these guys believe in sin. We believe in sin, but they don't want to see sin when it comes to their collective society. They want to see sin when it comes to Martin Luther King's neo-orthodoxy, which is unfortunate. But be that as it may, their forefathers are always presented by the exceptions. That's what Dabney did. He presented, that he wrote a letter, and I don't want to talk too much. I'll stop after this. He wrote a letter in 1865 to Oliver Howard, who is the founder of Howard University and who was the first director of the Freedmen's Bureau, a white military man. Lincoln appointed him as the Freedmen's Bureau guy. And Dabney had the audacity to write to him to give him advice about how to take care of black people. And he said, and he told him, he said, this is another quote. You can see I have a Dabney sheet. Okay. He said, he boasted that the South had, quote, provided for the wants of the Negro, end quote. So that, quote, his numbers have doubled themselves as rapidly as those of the whites, end quote. Now, first of all, the man is a freaking liar. This is why if you're going to put King in hell, I'm putting Dabney in hell. Okay. I'm not saying he's there, but I'm saying he's a good candidate for hell because he's a liar. At least some people, they changed their minds or they did what they did in the midst of that sin. This guy is still lying about it after the fact. Number two, you're saying that you gave them all the wants and you gave them all their needs. That's not the truth about slavery, and we all know it. And these guys need to read the extensive slave narratives, and they need to read all the work that was done in the 20th century. Yes, Voices from Slavery. They were not well taken care of.
Yeah.
They didn't, they were taking care of the master and his family and white society. These people got rich on the labor that was taken from other people's bodies.
Yeah, and then they had
they're willing to admit that.
And then they had poor Southerners go fight for them,
Yeah. And they sent all those poor white boys from the South. They filled their heads with all this patriotism, and they all went to die. But it was these slaveholders, especially these rich, powerful slaveholders, that made all the money. So I have a hard time seeing this with any kind of, patience, because after a while it gets very tired.
Yeah, it's just such a mistake. As a Christian, you want to be engaged in cultural issues, apologetics. It's such a mistake to spend that intellect, that power, that time on defending Southern slavery. Come on, guys, what a waste. Here, speaking of the slave narratives and the way folks are treated, I got something for that.
Do you just free them into a vacuum? They can't really take care of themselves. Many of them, and this is hard for people to believe, that the conditions of slavery are not what we are led to believe. Were bad conditions for some people. There's no doubt. But if you look at the slave narratives, Fogel and Ingerman show that about 60 to 80% of them don't have anything negative to say about their life in slavery. And you read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. He talks about they were freed and they go to the plantation house and they just cry with their master because this is the person that they're attached to. It's the home in which they've raised kids and made meals. And when they were sick, their master took care of them. And there's this, people can't conceive of this today. And it's one of the, Eugene Genovese, who I think is probably one of the best, he is the best historian of slavery, chattel slavery in the United States in the 20th century. He came to recognize this and writes about it in Mind of the Master class, and he was a recovering Marxist, by the way. And he came to see that the mechanization of modernity, whether Marxism or capitalism, it makes you a number. And you end up getting enslaved civilly somehow. And that there was something, he didn't like every aspect of slavery, but he knew that there was just something that bound many of these Christian slave masters to their slaves in a caring kind of way that you just did not see in these other systems. And there was something worth learning from there. Maybe not even preserving the institution in every way, but learning from the way that they got along with each other. And so this is the context we're talking about. This is the context where foreign observers who came over said, like Tocqueville even said that, hey, the racism in the North worse. Or I don't know if he used that term because that term wasn't invented yet. But
okay, we're halfway through the clip. A few things I want to say, and then I want to hear what you have to say, of course, Dr. DeCaro. One is, it's always bizarre to me. These guys will sometimes be like, well, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she never visited the South. What would she know about Uncle Tom's Cabin? But these foreigners, from France, they came over and they got it right away. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So what do they take? They're taking a tour of the plantation. And, and the masters are showing them all the best stuff. I mean, it's like, do we really think the Frenchmen? I get it. It's interesting to have outside dispassionate voices. Perhaps we might say, who knows what's going on with them or whatever. But as if that's the source of authority. Not the slave narratives. At least that's the way, not the autobiographies of people who talk about sexual abuse and the things they saw and the horrible things they had to experience. And a lot of times it's interesting, even if you read some of these autobiographies, or these accounts, even if their situation wasn't so bad, they always knew someone else's situation who was really bad. Because I don't think it's the exception like this being painted and some of these, what I think are frankly revisionist histories. And you go on and you say, okay, what is going on here? But there was more stuff in that clip I want to comment on. But Dr. DeCaro, that clip, which is halfway over, if you could, please.
Yeah, just to say, again, this is about taking exceptions and saying that this is the norm, when in fact, how much of a relationship could a slaveholder have if he had 1,000 people on his plantation? Was he warm and fuzzy with all those folks? Yes, we know, again, that there were. I mean, I think that probably if you could use the bell curve, if I can use that expression, that there were some people on the very one side of the bell curve that had literally hellish, barbaric, maniacal, crazy masters, and on the other side, on that small part, you had saintly masters who planted flowers outside their slave dwellings and prayed with them and did all this kind of stuff. But the norm of the institution is premised on forcing people to work, and the idea that if they
don't get nothing for it hardly, except to live.
They don't get nothing for it, except for to live, and then the idea that if these people were free, oh gosh, they'd just be in a vacuum. They wouldn't know what to do. But the reality is that, if you read, there's a book called, not North of Slavery, but as a book called Been in the Storm So Long by Lawrence Litwack, which is about what happened immediately after emancipation. And what you will be amazed to see is the image of God in Black people becomes so actualized that when these people are free, the first thing they did was go find their relatives, go find their family, their husbands, their wives, their children. After that, they got involved in business. They got involved in education. They got involved in politics. They studied. These people hit the ground running, and they built a society for themselves. Don't tell me setting them free in a vacuum and they'd be like an infant lying in the dirt. This, again, shows you he's working from a framework of racial oppression. He may himself be I think he is a well-meaning guy, but he's thinking inside a box that has been constructed for him, and he's trying to beautify that box, and he's telling us, well, it was really pretty nice for the most part, because these French people came and saw it, and like you said, they brought him on a tour of the big house and showed all the happy people, and that was how they talked about it. But the reality is people were running away all the time. The reality is people didn't want to go back. Yes, there were people who went back, but most of the people who ran away didn't go back. That when slavery came, what did Black people, was the response, oh no? Do you see masses of Black people who were enslaved who said, no, we just want to stay here. We're good.
Can't believe it's over. This was the time of my life. It's like, right. That's why Juneteenth exists, is because it was a celebration. You celebrate when this is the case. It was a celebration.
Yeah.
It was, and it's interesting. Oh, they're going to be so awful. Well, look at immediately after Reconstruction, when civil rights were granted. And this is before Jim Crow. This is like almost like the best position timed to see what really happened, because it was before the oppression of Jim Crow that made things actually worse.
Exactly.
And again, there's you see the South's will to liberate folks. Well, how do they do it? It's slavery by a different name, basically. So here you go, Reconstruction. Now again, no period is perfect and all that, but you see some amazing things happen. But the problem is, and Grant's not perfect either, but basically after Grant, there wasn't the same level of will from the North to really go and enact these things. It's like, well, let the South work it out on their own. Well, they weren't going to work it out on their own properly. And that's why Grant said, no, we got to have people down there making them work it out on their own. And instead, a situation had to be fixed later on. And if we're going to call it that, and it's just like, come on, why are we wanting to defend this? And you know what? Another thing is, if you have somebody who's able to show love, they have a capacity to show love, even in the midst of, they're working out a Christian ethic where they show love to their enemies. I don't want to take someone who was a formerly enslaved person and their capacity to forgive and be godly and be Christ-like as equaling the merit and virtue of the slave master. Just because they can say, hey, I bid you adieu, we're not going to come kill, whatever, goodbye to this person and that person in the household, doesn't mean the slave master was always so great. A lot of these folks were really able to exhibit a Christ-like virtue that goes beyond a lot of our understanding and capacity. And you see that all the way into the day in South Carolina in the modern era, where these folks forgave Dylan Roof at his arraignment or whatever it was. And it's just like, whoa, this is mind-blowing stuff. This is being Christ-like, because Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Don't take it as, man, those Roman centurions must have been really nice. They were some nice guys. No, Jesus exhibits God's character. That's what it is, people. I'm sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Amen to that.
All right, now let's take a look here where sometimes he says, okay, some things in the South didn't quite meet the biblical standard. So I'm glad we got this.
I think it's called A Consuming Fire, where he talks about Southern Christian preachers specifically and how they grappled with some of the things that did not quite meet a biblical standard in Southern slavery.
These things didn't quite meet a biblical standard, just a few elements. They weren't quite up to par. This is actually, by the way, this is Doug Wilson's argument. Now the clip's not over. I'm going to play it, and I'm so sorry. Doug Wilson in his book "Slavery as It Was" in Black and Tan. This is the kind of stuff he says, and I despise that book. Here's this.
So you could think of anti-literacy laws, which were really to prevent slaves from reading abolitionist literature that would maybe inspire them to kill and cause an insurrection. They didn't want them to read that, so they had anti-literacy laws, right? They were neglected. They were, very famously, Stonewall Jackson taught slaves to read the Bible anyway, and it was just something that they didn't really enforce. But they were on the books in many Southern states.
The only reason they had to do those anti-literacy laws, is just so they wouldn't read that literature that would incite them to rebel.
Yeah. That's right. The reality is they were afraid of the Bible. They were afraid that African people would read the whole Bible and not just the parts they excerpted. And that's why they didn't want them to read, because we all know, just like these guys know, because they're reformed, right? Are these guys reformed?
Yeah, they're both reformed. That's why I'm kind of hitting this, by the way, because it's sort of within my theological circle in a manner of speaking. Go ahead.
Yeah, we who believe in the doctrines of grace and who uplift the Word of God know that the power of the Word of God is such that it is transformative of individuals and societies. And the fact that they withheld that, and this, let me just, because this is a footnote that I wanted to bring out, which is to say, all the way back to talking about the slavery. What is the one distinctive? We can look at all this slavery in history, but what's interesting is what makes U.S. chattel slavery perhaps the worst form of slavery in the history of the world is not even the extent of the numbers or the cruelty. It was that this is the first time an institution is prevailing over humans based on their color and origin and in the name of Christianity.
Yeah,
that never existed in the history of the church.
Yeah, before you had pagans doing it, and not that it was okay when pagans did whatever they did, but how do you have people that say, I believe in the Bible, they have the Bible in one hand and a whip in another? It's just like, no.
Talk about the judgment. Talk about the judgment that they're going to have to answer for. That they had all of history. They had the full Bible. They had Paul, and they have the lessons of history and the ethics of history, and they still re-energize slavery to the extent that they made it racialized, they made it cruel and ruthless, and they used a system of propaganda, and they used a sunny side argument to justify it. And unfortunately, again, these dear brothers are still working out of that complex of ideas. It's really not that complicated. It's complicated because you need to make it complicated in order to justify what you're justifying. But if you were enslaved, you wouldn't think it was all that complicated. And again, I bring you to the golden rule. It's as simple as the golden rule. And that's what John Brown said.
No, this is
they don't want to
right
hear that because John Brown was violent.
Yeah, and I like what you say about John Brown. John Brown's not so much a terrorist as he is a counter-terrorist.
Absolutely.
Here you got, this is bizarre, where Pastor Joel, he says, well, let me play devil's advocate. Usually when people say devil's advocate, it's like the other side, the bad side, right? He's doing it as the abolitionist, the modern abolitionist supporting people would do. And I'm just like, what a strange use of devil's advocate. But it's not just that semantic issue I have a problem with. It's what he actually says. Listen to this here.
That's the reality. So my point is back to Dabney and slavery. Because I'm just thinking of the devil's advocate, an abolitionist who's listening to this episode and saying, well, Joel, you forgot to mention that Exodus and Leviticus, they don't just mention the man stealer, but also anyone found to then hold that slave. So it could be not just the man stealer. I think of like Joseph and his enslavement. That it's, I forget exactly who, it might have been the Chaldeans or it was something, but then he was stolen by his brothers, technically, would be the man stealers, and then sold to the Chaldeans, and then eventually sold to Egypt, right? So you have 3 degrees of separation by that point. So here's the question. Was Potiphar in sin? I think Potiphar was probably in sin for being a pagan and worshiping Egyptian gods. But was Potiphar in sin for owning Joseph? As a benevolent, his wife, she was trash, but Potiphar himself, he was a benevolent master. He treated Joseph well. Joseph rises Joseph has more, probably is eating better and has more provisions as Potiphar's slave than he had back with his father Jacob.
There's another minute of that clip, but I just want to remind everybody. Remember what the Israelites said when they were out there in the wilderness? Man, we want those cucumbers from Egypt. These kind of arguments are so bizarre when you think about. It's like, well, wait, what's the moral issue here? There's like these pragmatic, well, look at it. What's the moral issue here? But I'll let you comment on that before I play the rest of the clip here.
And just to point, yes. And the other thing about Christian slavery in North America was it didn't have the variegated form that African and Near Eastern slavery did. He's talking about Joseph. Joseph was a slave. As a matter of fact, Joseph was probably a slave until he died. He was a slave of Pharaoh. But as he's not realizing is that one of the things that happened even in Roman slavery is that there was a category of slaves where you were kind of middle management and you were very prosperous. You could even own slaves yourself.
Yeah.
And in the ancient
imagine in antebellum South, the vice president being an enslaved person, right?
That's right. It didn't happen.
That's a point you're making.
It didn't happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It did not happen. You did not see. Maybe it happened once or twice, but the reality is you don't use Joseph to justify the enslaved Africans in South Carolina. None of them ever had the opportunities Joseph had or given power or privilege, because that's not what white Christians did in American slavery. They stole everything from these people, from their identity as Africans. Their bodies did not belong to themselves. Their children did not belong to themselves. The fruit of their labor was not theirs. And yet you want to talk about Joseph? Give me a break, brother. That does not fly.
Facts.
Just doesn't fly.
Just so you guys know what he's talking about there is Exodus chapter 21. Exodus 21 verse 16 says, anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. And so he's like saying, well, how do we work that out? And what's interesting is, I believe Joel himself, I don't think John is, but Joel's a theonomist. So this would be like, you got to apply Old Testament case law. Now, I was reading something earlier today. Where'd it go? The Puritan spirits in the abolitionist imagination. And they talked about, okay, there was some slavery, for example, under the Puritans, but even that that they did have when they had it was better than what happened in the South, because there was certain laws and rights that had to be respected. And if it was demonstrated someone that was obtained by kidnapping, they would be forced to grant them their freedom. And this is not like a pro-Puritan book here by Kenyon Grader, by the way, but it mentioned that, meaning there's some kind of like, okay, let's work this out. So I'm going to play the rest of this clip, if that's okay. Here we go.
When they were suffering, and weren't quite as rich and weren't quite as wealthy and didn't have some of the modern comforts of Egypt and blah, blah, blah. And so my point is, was Potiphar in sin? Joseph's brothers were in sin because they wrongfully, sold their brother into slavery. They stole him, enslaved him, and sold him. And then maybe even the first degree of whatever it was, the Chaldeans or whoever first bought Joseph, knowing that his brothers were selling him. Joseph wasn't indebted. He wasn't in slavery because of debt, or he was just stolen by his brothers and sold for silver. And so maybe there's imputed guilt. And I think you could argue from Leviticus and Exodus that the immediate buyers of Joseph, that there was an imputed guilt there. But then what about Egypt? And then what about Potiphar? And then what about later on? And so my point is this. I think that the providence factor kicks in. Joe Biden, I don't even know if he's alive, but at a certain...
He goes on to basically say he's the rightful ruler because of the situation we're already in. And that's where he's talking about the providence factor. That was his illustration there. But I think most translations usually say that they're Midianites, by the way. That's my understanding of who the group was, because he was talking about that, just as for the audience's edification. But comment on the rest of that if you want or not. We have a few more we can get to.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Getting back to that good Scottish Calvinist abolitionist Alexander MacLeod, who wrote in 1802. One of the things I think he would say to this whole use of the Old Testament, particularly Hebrew slavery, as a justification, he said, if you're going to use that argument, then you've got to theologically, and I guess hermeneutically, you've got to demonstrate how the privileges of a slave master, a Hebrew slave master, are extended to you. Because if you can't argue that, if you can't prove that, you're just appropriating that from this text, then you can't sell it. So MacLeod would say, you're talking about all this slavery in the Old Testament, but why do you get to appropriate that? We, in our Christian hermeneutics, our understanding of reading, and I guess maybe part of the problem is he is a theonomist, but a correct understanding, even as Reformed people, which would be, we do not appropriate stuff from the Old Testament unless it's mediated through the New Covenant. We read the Old Covenant through the New Covenant. So we don't appropriate whatever we want from the Old Testament unless Jesus, our Lord, and the apostles bring that into the New Covenant. Otherwise, it belongs to the ancient Hebrews. It doesn't belong to us. And I would argue that nowhere does Jesus or the apostles give us the Hebrew standards for being slaveholders.
Well, I got that for the next clip in a way, a little bit of what you're talking about. But yeah, one problem I see, audience guys here, is a problem of understanding Old Covenant versus New Covenant. And something that Reformed Baptistic types has understood, and this is what these guys are supposed to be, is that, hey, there's a newness to the New Covenant. We're not Presbyterians. We don't flatten it out. That's why we don't baptize babies. I'm talking to the Reformed Baptistic types here in the audience. The issue of cessationism or continuationism, I'm bracketing that. I'm just talking about the issue of the covenants and how that relates. And when you look at this, you say, okay, what's going on? And guys, it is the case that Jesus gives a higher standard than Moses. And it makes sense because he brings grace upon grace, and he's a greater teacher than Moses, and the New Covenant is superior to the Old. So if that sounds shocking, it shouldn't. I'm going to recommend a book by a New Covenant theologian who I love, John Reisinger, and the name of the book is In Defense of Jesus, the New Lawgiver. And there's another book, and I'm forgetting the author off the top of my head. It might be by Blake White, but it's called The Newness of the New Covenant. These are two books I recommend that they're not directly addressing slavery, but I think they would help work this out. But here's where they bring up Jesus and Paul, Dr. DeCaro.
A lot of slaves and a lot of these big plantations and so forth. And so anyway, all that to say, You look at the Greco-Roman slave system, it has many abuses. It's horrible. What does Paul say? What does Jesus say? Jesus gives parables that include slavery, and he doesn't denounce it. He even talks about many lashes. In one of his parables, he says that the slave who doesn't follow essentially what his master told him will receive many lashes. It's like, what? Jesus said that? Yeah, he did. Paul talks about the responsibilities of slaveholders many times. In fact, there's a whole book, Philemon, which some modern, like reading the Bible while black. I remember I read that book by Esau McCaulley. He twists it beyond recognition to try to make it an anti-slavery book. Just read it. That's not what's going on at all in that book. Just read it in context. He nowhere.
There's more to that. I'm going to continue his exegesis, Philemon, here in a second. He's talking about reading while black by Esau McCaulley, by the way there. Okay, so the thing with Jesus mentioning lashes in a parable, I mean, Jesus has a king who talks about slaughtering all my enemies and all kinds of other stuff. He's using parables from everyday life, not necessarily saying it's good or bad, because he has examples of dishonest business managers and all kinds of other stuff. So saying Jesus mentioning lashes that someone would is it's sort of odd to me, but I think what John would say is something along the lines of, well, yeah, but that was his chance to condemn slavery there. And he didn't take it, something like that. But I want to let you comment there before I play the rest of that clip. Go ahead, brother.
Yeah. Well, yeah, your points are well taken. And then, to add that would be to say, why would anybody at that period of history be anti-slavery? There was no such, in other words, we have to see, in order for us to conceptualize a contemporary pro-slavery or anti-slavery argument, you have to conceptualize the possibility that slavery was negotiable. You have to understand that slavery in the time of Jesus, in the time of Paul, in the time of the ancient Romans and Greeks, slavery, as I said, was the electricity that ran the world. Nobody had the individualistic idea of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Not even the Christians did. It's not necessarily a biblical idea, but I think we would argue that just like penicillin is a great development, so is the idea of separation of church and state. So is the idea of individual liberty and freedom. So my point would be to say, this whole idea that you're saying, well, Jesus never condemned slavery, Paul never condemned it, or on the flip side of the people who hate the Bible who are saying, well, Paul was about slavery and Paul is, but that's really a ludicrous, it's an anachronistic argument. You are stepping into a time machine and going back and evaluating these people on the basis of the way you think after centuries of development in culture and society. So yes, nobody's going to be arguing against slavery in the Bible. Slavery is assumed. But notice that who's the first person to use slavery referentially to represent something true that is sinful? It's Jesus. And you can see this in the early work of David Bryan Davis, the scholar on slavery. It's Jesus who is the first person to take slavery and make it a metaphor for sin. And it is because Jesus put the idea of slavery as a metaphor for sin on track, put wheels on it, that down the road we would, as Christians, begin to see something problematic. The Muslims have this thing, well, if you're a Muslim, you can't be a slave. But Christians, also have this idea that we began to have this idea in the Middle Ages. You can't enslave a Christian brother or sister. Because again, they were not politically and socially evolved to think as moderns do, but they began to recognize there's a problem with enslaving somebody who shares your faith. But then when you come to the good Southerners, the good Presbyterian Baptist Southerners, they don't care anymore. It doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. If you're black, you're a slave. So again, I'm holding them accountable based on the application of the Word of God. You're holding them accountable on the basis of the application of the Word of God as it's hermeneutically sensible and readable. These guys are trying to go back and argue that because Paul was writing to Philemon about Onesimus, and that's not about slavery. Well, no, it's not a modern abolitionist tract. That's not the point. But the point is, Paul is laying the depth charges that are going to make it difficult in the future for Christians to have other Christians as slaves. And if you can't see the radical nature of what Paul's, he's not a modern and he's not a liberal or a Westerner or whatever, but what he's saying is unconventional.
Yeah.
This guy is my brother, your brother. Now, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
What are you going to do about it?
The seeds
That's
of
what Paul's
abolition
are right there in the New Testament, and including Philemon. Here we go with the rest of this clip.
Goes against the social systems. But there is a reforming element that happens here, because we're not going to operate in the sinful way that those in our pagan society are operating when it comes to this. We're not going to violate the commands of God. And
we're not
going to
throw slaves to lions in a coliseum for sport.
No.
So
they're your Christian brothers.
Right.
They're, when they convert, they're the mission field, and when they convert, they're your Christian brothers, and you need to treat them that way. And that there is a revolution.
And that's why they said, hey, you sit over there, or you don't sit over there at all, or you stand right here, right?
I suppose you could say, element to that eventually perhaps did lead to the overturn of slavery in a way. I'm open to that. I think William Wilberforce, by the way, you mentioned him, he is someone who is ardently against the slave trade. And that was, I think, unquestionably a Christian thing to, because you look at this and the conditions on those boats were horrific. Just the way that the whole thing started and the way it was sourced was horrible. And he was taking a stand against a great evil and wanting to end it. If you're in a boat that's sinking, you try to stop the leak. And that's what he was doing. And so, yes, a lot of the guys, Dabney included, were against that as well. But once you're downstream from that particular problem and you are left with a very real, tangible situation like a Greco-Roman slave system that has many wicked things attached to it, what do? You live the way Paul said to live. And that's what...
I'll let you comment here real quick, but one thing that's interesting about these guys, this tack that they take, is different than what you usually hear most Christian apologists do when confronted with the issue of, well, what about slavery in the New Testament? A lot of times people draw out to say, hey, look, Greco-Roman slavery, not perfect, but it's not antebellum slavery. Here's ways, some of the ways in which basically it was better because of X, Y, Z. These guys take the opposite approach. They go at great lengths to show Greco-Roman slavery was by far worse and antebellum slavery was much, much better. But that's not the main context of what we're talking about here. But you want to comment on the remainder of that clip that I just played, my friend?
Yeah, well, let me start. He mentioned Dabney, so I got one more Dabney thing, because I could be Dabney day in and day out, all day long.
We should do a whole show on Dabney.
Yes.
Just put like his picture on the front, just put a big X through it, Okay, go ahead.
That's right. Well, Dabney believed, this is his rationale for equality. Let me see if I can find it now. Oh boy.
Arwell Dabney, just in case you guys know, he was a prominent Reformed theologian and an ardent defender of slavery, and of course of Virginia as well. And he's come more and more under fire, as he should, as it's become more and more known by more and more people about how much of a pro-slaver and bigot he was. And there's some people who view that as just, that's just moderns, critiquing the heroes of ancient, but it's actually a lot deeper and, be frank with you, simpler than that. And sometimes they use this word, they'll say the post-war consensus or the post-war liberal consensus. And I heard one guy make a funny joke. It was Owen. He said, if we did a drinking game with every time these guys said post-war liberal consensus, which is almost like this made-up category in some ways they've made about, now we look at things this way. You'd get a lot of it because it's like their way to dismiss a lot of stuff. But go ahead, Dabney, quote, what you got?
Yeah. You know what? The quote I was trying to find, I can't. So let me just paraphrase it, and it's in there. But what he was saying is the Jacobin idea of equality is that everybody is equal. But he said that's not biblical equality. Biblical equality is the equal of everybody in their particular station. I'm paraphrasing it, but what he said was that we're not all equal. There's inferiors, there's superiors, and they're all equal with respect to each other. So that's Dabney after slavery. So this is the reasoning of this great Christian. This idea again of benign Christianity. There were individuals who have lived that way, and how they styled it and how they argued for it. Like you see in the case of Dabney, how he tells you what slavery was about after the fact is just doesn't line up with the facts. The facts are that this was a brutal, unfair institution. It was inherently violent, and a lot of women, God forbid, they were attractive women. You know what was going to happen to them.
Yeah.
I did, just very quickly, I did a survey of the black of the slave masters and black enslaved people in the town of Charlestown, which is where John Brown spent his last days and where he was hanged. I was trying to identify, and what I saw is that in almost every home where there was a slave master, there was a woman, an enslaved woman of childbearing age, there was often a mulatto child. And they called them mulatto because they made those kind of racialist differentiations. Why? Why are there mulatto children in these nice, good Christian domestic homes where there's maybe only 2 or 3 slaves? Not to mention what would happen if you had a plantation with 500.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you explain the racial characteristics, so-called? I hate to talk about people, but the beautiful array of black melanin is beautiful, humanly speaking. But we also know that a lot of that in the background happened because these Christian slaveholders were not all that Christian, even the ones who went to church.
Yeah.
And
I think a lot of modern genetics show that up. And, we don't know every story behind every DNA test, but you say, wow, that's a lot of European DNA. And how did that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we have a few guesses as to how that might have happened. About the abuses of slavery, this is our second to last clip, and it talks a little bit about the kidnapping. And I found this interesting, the way they dealt with it.
And I'm just realizing things are not nearly as simple as we like to make them out to be.
That was a really, really good point. And I would say that the reason I brought up the story of Booker T. Washington and his family crying when they were freed with the plantation owners is because there was this mutual love that often took place and happened. It's a reality. And you can see it with the slave narratives. You can see it with foreign observers and what they saw. You can see it with even Census Bureau data, which shows that families seem to thrive in the South, slave families, more than free blacks in the North. And so all this stuff paints a picture that's very different than the picture that we have. And I'll tell you a story about my grandfather. He died this year at 101.
He talks about his grandfather in Mississippi, who was like buddies with one guy who was a former, I think, Confederate soldier, and then someone else who was a former enslaved person, and da-da-da. It's sort of an anecdotal story. But there they brought up some of those same points there that you can see. And I'd love to hear what you have to say, Dr. DeCaro.
Well, let me tell a story that I know. I have a friend, he's an elderly Virginian, and a John Brown enthusiast, by the way.
Yeah.
Not all Southerners have a veil over their heart. And my friend, who's a man who was in his 80s, when he was young, he was from a very poor white family in Virginia, and he worked in the fields at 5 years of age, picking whatever he was picking in the fields. And he often worked with black men, young black men, older black men. And he said, I learned to understand that the way black men conducted themselves in the presence of the white supervisor was very different from how they spoke about them after they left.
Mm-hmm.
They smiled. They were always warm and always, cordial, and showed a real genuine kind of care for the white man. But as soon as he left, they called him an SOB and cursed him up and down every which way. And he said, as a child, I learned that very quickly. And maybe that's why he hates racism himself, and he loves John Brown. And I think a lot of this stuff,
survival mechanism. But go ahead.
Survival. Yeah. So exactly what he's conveying are these stories. He's taking them at face value. You've got to realize that black people are as intelligent as white people, and in the absence of the ability to fight and overthrow, they learn tactics to survive. One of them was to love. Now, I'm not saying there were never cases of love, but you can't take all those loving stories at face value. And again, the truth of it is, when freedom came, when any opportunity came, most black people took it. They took that opportunity. And when the end of slavery came, the black community was happy. They weren't crying, and they didn't miss their slave masters. So, this is the kind of stuff that it really becomes where you're sort of inoculating yourself so that you are not going to actually be able to see the truth, because you've got yourself put to sleep. It's like drinking warm milk, and you want to go to sleep with the happy vision of slavery not being all that bad. But I want to tell him, no, brother, that's not the truth. The truth is slavery was an awful thing. And even if the people, why did Spartacus revolt? He didn't have an idea about independence and individual freedom. Slavery sucked. It sucks. And I would dare say this, and I'm going to stop. This dear brother, if he came from a family that had been enslaved, and I don't know if he's married, and I don't know if he has children, but if somebody came in, if I came in and took him at gunpoint and took his wife, and I was able to hold them in slavery and rape his wife and force him to work and take everything he ever made, and I did that, and then my son did that to his children, and we continued to do that for him, I doubt that he'd be making the same argument. A lot of this goes back to the golden rule. John Brown was right. It's about the golden rule, and these guys are not reading history through the golden rule.
Yeah,
They're
I
not.
think he would have a lot different view of a lot of this stuff if that was the case.
Yeah.
I really think so, and that's what we need to do is to put ourselves in the place of others, and then we apply the golden rule. And I've heard some of these guys complain, "Oh, you're using general biblical guides to override specific instructions." This kind of thing. It's as if a way to kind of get around it. It's like, come on, man. But okay, so this is actually our last clip, and it just kind of sums up the abolitionist bad thing. I think it's a brief clip. Let me.
Final arbiter of truth. So that's the standard. But so not as a substitute for that. But then around that, in ways that are consistent with that final arbiter, the Word of God, we do need to then beef up our understanding of history and philosophy and these kinds of things. And as I have, and I have a lot more to learn, but as I have, what I've been realizing, rapidly is the abolitionists were not the good guys.
Let me read for you, if you have a minute,
Yeah.
just some brief quotes from abolitionists, just to kind of shock people.
We're upset with him. K-Dub, Chris, he's African-American, Christian, Reformed, Baptist.
So what he goes on, what Joel is saying is, hey, I realize we need to have a robust view of history, but that's what we're going to do on today's program. That's what he's saying. And then John says, well, let me give you some examples. The abolitionists are because Joel says abolitionists aren't the good guys, they're the bad guys. He literally says it. That's how he paints it. And then John says, well, let me provide some quotes from abolitionists who are clearly white supremacists or who are bigots themselves. And for example, the quote with the one guy who wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic. And I liked your program on that, where you talked about the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and it was sort of an attempt at respectable politics to replace the John Brown's body joint, which is more radical and all that. And anyways, shared the racist sentiment. And there's other examples of that. And, we've talked about this, but that doesn't, it's funny. First of all, it's like by showing that some Northerners or abolitionists were that way doesn't, change what was going on in the South. And it doesn't fix any of the problems to show that they're all bad or anything like that. And so it was strange, but there you see, abolitionists bad, Southern slave owners good. Yeah. There you see.
Yeah, that's a bunch of reductionist nonsense. And I'll actually go one farther on it. I'll go one further with them, and with you, of course, being an exception. And that's a commentary on white society. It's not a commentary on abolitionists.
Yeah.
That this is what we have been propagandized by, this idea that white people, generally speaking, didn't believe in slavery. The truth of the matter is that most white people in the 18th and 19th and probably in the 20th century too do not actually practice or believe or desire equality with black and other non-whites, but especially black people who they see as our former slaves. This is a problem with white society. Lincoln, Charles Finney, he was a heretic beside, but Charles Finney was a segregationist. He didn't like the presence of black people. Most white people in the days of slavery found the black presence a problem in general. So when you're coming and saying that, all you're doing is you're specializing or reducing a particular truth as if it's just about the abolitionists. The reality is, this was a society that was premised on racism. And I know people think, oh, that's a Marxist idea. No, it's not. It's a historically grounded truth. Abraham Lincoln thought black people were inferior. Finney thought black people were inferior. Thomas Jefferson thought almost any place you go, you will find that they did not believe black people were socially equals. And Carl Truman, who writes about Martin Luther, says this very same thing. People always condemn Luther for that ugly outpouring of anti-Semitism in the last part of his life. And it is ugly. But the truth is that Luther was falling back more into the ways of his people, because most Germans hated Jews. And
this stuff appeals to the flesh. It appeals to the flesh.
Yes. So this is why we need to repent, and this is why the issue of racism is still on the table. And we don't need to pass the blame and start blaming a bunch of dead abolitionists. Of course, we know a lot of them were actually heterodox and heretical. They were. But you know what? If you were down in a hole and somebody threw you a rope and it was a Jehovah's Witness, you'd be happy to be pulled up by a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, that's right. No doubt about that. Shout out to the live chat here. I want to give a shout out to D New and Nate holding it down as wonderful moderators. Shout out to Caldwell Apologetics and In Context with Jim Green. Everybody, please subscribe to their channels. Great apologetics works. Don't forget, of course, to subscribe to the John Brown Today podcast by Dr. Louis DeCaro Jr. And I got a warrior woman who I also want to give a shout out. She's part of the squad that we have, and she drops the link for the fire from the midst of you, John Brown's religious life. And she says, here's the review, that it's probably the best single book on John Brown out there. This is a groundbreaking work. If you really want to understand John Brown, this is the book. Hey, I praise. That's from that's fantastic. Wow. That deserves an air horn there. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if you were paying attention to the chat or saw anything that you else wanted to address. We had almost 300 comments in the live chat today. A lot of great, insightful comments. And guys, we may still be discussing this in the future at various times. There's still more I want to cover on some of the slavery issues that they've brought up and whatnot. And now, I don't know if you guys have seen, but lately James White, who, it's strange his position, all this, but he's been trying to offer some balance to these guys. Now, I don't mean specifically Joel and John. I'm talking about other guys within the Christian Nationalist 2.0 set, or whatever you wanted to call it, dealing with them about bringing some balance to this new fascination and romanticization they've adopted of the Crusades. And it's really weird, because it's like, you guys are Reformed, and now the Crusades, that's our hero archetype. What is going on here? And the Twitter exchanges have been actually very fascinating and enlightening there, from all these guys with, the blue eyes and the red shade going on. But there's a lot more to discuss. Final words, Dr. DeCaro, and thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to a great material from you in the future. And one day we've got to cover your Malcolm and the Cross book. This is such a great book. I love this book, The Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, and Christianity. You guys definitely want to snatch this up too. But final words, my friend.
Well, I want to thank you. It's been good to be with you. Appreciate your ministry and what you're doing, what you've done. And thank you for the opportunity. And, I guess we just got to pray for folks that the Lord will open their eyes, because we have to address these issues, because again, there are people on the liberal left that they've gone to such extremes with their ideology. And then we have people on the conservative side who don't want to address these things. And when you talk about them, they say you're a Marxist. But the reality is, we're just Christians reading history, wrestling with the realities, and desiring to see the body of Christ at least become more of what we're supposed to be. So that's what I can offer. I'm glad that I can be with you. It's an honor to share time with you. Thank you so much, Vocab.
Thank you. Last comment on the content. I see Thrifty Treasure brought up. Read the Freedmen's Bureau records for accounts of former enslaved people and the cases they filed due to abuse that continued after slavery. Thank you for that comment. And it's interesting because they bring up the public works interviews. And I like what Joel McDermott in his book, The Problem of Slavery in Christian America, he brought out how some of those have been skewed, and there's even evidences we have where the same person was interviewed in another context. And so we can actually see the answers are different depending on who they understand the audience to be and things like that. And so there is some complexity in answering some of these arguments. And I know everyone's not going to become a John Brown or Civil War expert overnight, but that's why we bring this program to you. And thank you very much, Dr. DeCaro, for doing that. You guys, hope to see you again. God bless. Peace out. Much love.